A new solid was created over my composition, and then the tool CC Particle World was selected. The particle type was then adjusted to darken and faded sphere, and the birth and depth size as well as the opacity map were adjusted. The birth and depth colors were then changed, and then the animation setting was altered to Viscous. The glow tool was then selected and dragged onto the composition, and the glow threshold and radius were adjusted. Motion blur was then selected on the composition, and the fast blur tool was selected. The scale and positioning of the solid and the glow was adjusted so it was visible on the football, and the hue and saturation was adjusted. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering. A new solid was created labelled background, and the tool CC gradient ramp was selected. The colour of the composition was then adjusted, and then my logo was inserted onto it. A new solid was created labelled background shade, and the tool fractal noise was selected. Motion blur was then selected, and the logo was pre-composed. The scatter was changed to 500 and the ball size 300. All the keyframes were then selected and the speed graph was adjusted. The glow tool was then selected and the option invert selection was chosen whilst the glow was then adjusted. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering. A new solid labelled fire was created, and from the effects toolbar via simulation, the tool CC particle system was selected. The position of the particle system was then adjusted and the animation type was changed to explosive. It was then trimmed and positioned on the timeline so it revealed when I passed the ball. The particle type was then selected as bubble and the birth and depth size was adjusted. The longevity of the flame was also adjusted and motion blur was applied. A CC vector blur was then dragged onto the composition and the amount was changed to 11. From the effects toolbar via blur and sharpen, the tool CC Gaussian blur was selected. The echo tool was then selected from the tools and presets sidebar, and the amount of echoes was adjusted to 2, while the velocity changed to 0.4. A directional blur was then added and a color curve was selected and adjusted to alpha. The tool turbulence displace and offset turbulence was adjusted. Track motion tool was then selected to track the flame on the football. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering. The flame solid was copy-pasted onto another composition in After Effects. The flame was then adjusted on the timeline and then was rescaled and repositioned. The birth and depth colour was changed to a dark shade of blue throughout the whole flame. The flame was then positioned near my feet whenever I stepped on the grass. The flame was then duplicated for every step and was rescaled and repositioned for every flame. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering. A new solid labelled Tornado was created, and from the effects and presets toolbar, the CC Particle World tool was dragged onto the composition. The animation was adjusted from explosive to twirly, and the longevity and radius was altered. The particle type was then adjusted from line to faded sphere, and the birth and depth size as well as the birth and depth colour was altered. Another solid was then created labelled Texture, and the contrast was changed to 36 and the scale adjusted to 359, whilst the ellipse tool was selected to create a shape of the texture. The feather was then adjusted to make the texture more transparent, and the blending mode was selected as none. The texture was then pre-composed and the option to move all attributes into a new composition was selected. The option texture faded disc was selected and the solid was positioned to reveal when my foot touched the ground. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering. A new Premiere profile was created labelled cloning, and my 2 video clips were imported into Premiere. The first clip was then adjusted so that the second slid in between it. The opacity was lowered to 50% so I could see both videos clearly enough, and then the free draw Bezier was selected and a box was drawn around my body in the first video. The opacity was then adjusted back to 100% and the mask feather and mask expansion options were adjusted so that both my clones fitted perfectly within the composition. The file was then exported onto Adobe Media Encoder for rendering.